Now, less than a month before transition from the Biden administration to the incoming Trump administration, the United States continues to just dump in billions of dollars and all kinds of military gear and equipment into the Russia-Ukraine war on the side of Ukraine to try and make a difference of some sort. We're going to get into exactly what they're claiming, and then we're going to look at actually what the incoming administration is also planning to do. And as we always do, the most important thing really is to put the whole thing in context by looking at ground truth reality and seeing if what we're trying to do, what our country is claiming it to do, has any chance of actually manifesting on a battlefield. But before we do, given that this is December 24th, Christmas Eve, it's time we need to take a bit of a pause for something.
I have to show up.
Because this is Larry the Shirt Johnson here, and now this is important.
Got Santa on.
Because one of our most loyal viewers, Svetlana, before the show, this is important because she said this. So Svetlana, you nailed it. He did not disappoint. We didn't coordinate this ahead of time. I didn't look at your comment, but you were right. And just also to show you, we actually pay attention to what you guys are saying. Love having you on here. But Larry, I'm really glad you didn't disappoint Svetlana because she's really awesome.
We aim to please. Aim to please.
And I think you did. But speaking of aiming to please. Let's look at the outgoing administration and seeing what they're doing on the ground. Just in case anybody has missed this, you see this is the Washington Post just this morning, which it says, with the election over, Biden eyes parting blow to Putin war chest. So the idea is that he thinks that on the way out, he's going to, stab at thee as I die kind of thing, politically moving out, et cetera. And somehow that's going to be a really bad thing for Putin. And some of the stuff that's in this package are new interceptor missiles, and probably the biggest thing is more sanctions on the Russian energy system. One of the things, and actually I want to show you this on the screen here because I think it's kind of important to kind of understand what's going on here. But this is what the Biden administration, this is what the Washington Post is actually thinking that it has to do with. It says, if implemented, the penalties could help shape Biden's economic and foreign policy legacies before Trump's inauguration. A major move against Russia before leaving office would bolster Biden's claims to have rallied Western allies to respond forcefully to the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. So let me just ask you right off the top, Larry, is that, that just seems nonsensical to me to think that after 3 years of doing all this stuff that you now then on the way out the door, you think that you're going to, quote, cement your legacy and show the world that you did something by one more $1 billion package. What say you?
I think the Biden team's been drinking too much eggnog with overdoses of rum. I mean, this is drunken, delusional talk. We've seen this disconnect, Danny, going back 3 years. So back to February of 2022, the perception in the Biden White House, and actually I would argue it was fed and fueled by the intelligence community. In the past, I wanted to believe that perhaps the intelligence community was giving them the correct information and they were just insisting, oh no, we're going to have it our way, the Biden folks. But what we saw just recently with Donald Trump, and we talked about it, I think, last week, where during his Person of the Year interview with Time Magazine, he was referring to the briefings he received about the terrific, horrific casualties being suffered by the Russians, and fewer casualties, terrible, but fewer by the Ukrainians. Now, that's just a flat-out lie. It's just not true. There are objective ways to prove it. The one British group, Media Zona, has done a sort of the old-fashioned way, count the number of obituaries that are showing up in the newspapers in Russia and Ukraine. And in Russia, they take every single oblast. So, and they come up with a number about 82 million. Thank you there, Jude. Grandson bringing me a cup of coffee. Good boy. Santa will be nice to him. But the fact you got this disconnect where the intelligence community is telling Donald Trump that, then God knows what they've been telling Joe Biden. Well, we do know what they've been telling him, that if you provide this amount of aid, if you provide this particular weapon system, it's going to make a difference. And it doesn't make a bit of difference. You know, I recall in the summer of 2022, Scott Ritter and I got into a little bit of a debate, a friendly debate, but he described the HIMARS then as game changer. I said, it's not a game changer. Yeah, it's something new on the battlefield, but it's not going to change the game, the direction, because just the sheer numbers alone, the sheer industrial capability of Russia, and the size of the country and the physical size of its army dictated this thing was only going to end one way. So all Biden is doing right now is facilitating more murder. That's it. In my view, he's an international criminal.
And I want to read or touch on a couple things specified in this presumed new sanctions package. One is on the energy sector, but if you read down further in there, even some of the experts that the Washington Post talked to, they said it doesn't seem very likely this is actually going to bite. And because, and this is what I wanted to ask your opinion of with your experience. I mean, Russia's gotten pretty good at sanctions mitigation, haven't they? I mean, do we still have at the third year of war that all these sanctions that are sitting around we didn't use before that we could have? And I mean, why wouldn't we have used them before if they would work?
Yeah, well, see, before in February 2022, the notion of BRICS being an effective counter to the United States was really, nobody was talking about it back then. But then the combination of U.S. sanctions on Russia, coupled with sanctions also imposed on China by the United States, and the kind of bellicose language that was coming out of Washington, D.C., directed at Xi Jinping and the Chinese regime, that it brought the Chinese and Russians closer together. So by, January of 2023, February of 2023, they're having, hug it out, brother meetings, in Moscow, Beijing and Putin. Hey, you're my good friend. And so all of a sudden now you've united these two, and they are economic giants in different ways. Russia's a giant in terms of resources, natural resources, oil and gas. China in terms of industrial capability. But what do they need? Oh yeah, oil and gas. Marriage made in heaven. This is like those people that put chocolate and peanut butter together. Go, oh, we got a great treat. And so it's all of a sudden opened up this new global South-based economy where they're not going to be dependent upon Western finance. They're certainly not dependent upon Western resources. They don't have to rely upon Western expertise, because the actual expertise in terms of people being trained as engineers and physicists, that's coming out of Russia and China. That's not coming out of U.S. universities, or the ones that are graduating from U.S. universities happen to be coming from China. So this whole effort to use sanctions against Russia have backfired. Russia's not Syria. You can't crush Russia with sanctions. All you've done is force Russia to, like water. If water rushing downhill encounters an obstacle, it goes around it, yeah. Finds another way.
So yeah, and that's what we've seen happen. Which is one of the reasons why it just was kind of puzzling. That apparently they think that there'll be a different outcome this time. I don't know, but I want to. Yeah. So that's what Biden has said, right? So let's take a look at what some of his senior lieutenants have tried to explain over the last 2 or 3 weeks into why Biden is doing this. So first of all, I want to show you Jake Sullivan on 1 December talking about why he's going to provide this massive surge of stuff to Ukraine in the 11th hour.
When it comes to Abrams tanks, we have sent Abrams tanks to Ukraine. Those Abrams tanks units are actually undermanned because it's not the most useful piece of equipment for them in this fight, exactly as our military said. When it comes to F-16s, President Biden authorized the sending of F-16s to Ukraine last May. It's now December of 2024, and we've had a limited number of pilots trained, not because we're not prepared to train them, we are, as many as possible, but because the Ukrainians do not have the pilots to be able to build a full F-16 capability in time.
Sorry, I got those a bit out of order. The one that follows is where he's talking about this massive surge. But in this one, and the reason why I'm going to show you these two together, because they come a week apart. On December the 1st, he's sitting there talking about all this stuff we sent, whether Abrams tanks, Challengers, Leopards, Stryker vehicles, AMX-10s from France, etc. All these things we put on the battlefield, none of them made any difference at all. Then he talks about the F-16s, and you've already mentioned the HIMARS. All these were allegedly going to be game changers. None of them made any difference at all. In fact, I would argue that when you look at the performance of all of those categories of weapons that I just mentioned from the Western side, and then you compare them with what they had, and even we'll stay on the Ukraine side with the T-64s, T-72s, maybe a few T-80s they had, et cetera, some T-90s that they captured and used. I don't think there's a hair's breadth difference in the performance than any of those things. So they really didn't make any difference. So on the one hand, you have Blinken laying the foundation for none of this stuff matters. And then 1 week later, he adds this.
What are you telling your Ukrainian counterparts about American support in 51 days after Biden leaves office?
Well, first, what I'm saying is we are going to do everything in our power for these 50 days to get Ukraine all the tools we possibly can to strengthen their position on the battlefield so that they'll be stronger at the negotiating table. And President Biden directed me to oversee a massive surge in the military equipment that we are delivering to Ukraine so that we have spent every dollar that Congress has appropriated to us by the time that President Biden leaves office.
Okay, make this make sense for me, Larry. On December 1st, I tell you that all the stuff we've sent hadn't made any difference on the battlefield. And then 1 week later, I'm telling you that this massive surge is going to give us huge leverage to the incoming administration to craft out a deal that'll do something on the battlefield. How does that work?
It works great for the corporations, U.S. defense corporations that are getting paid to create that stuff and sell it to the U.S. government. But it doesn't make a difference. That Sullivan, on one hand, they're acting like this is a baseball team and they only have one baseball. And so they're just waiting for more baseballs to show up so the team can play. But that's not the problem. They don't have any players. They don't have pitchers, catchers, and third basemen. They're lacking. Ukraine is lacking in players. Why are they lacking in players? Because the Russians have killed them. A lot of them. Probably upwards of 1 million. And it's an enormous death toll, and it's not going to get any better. So that this notion that they've got, the one game changer in this that we haven't really discussed throughout are drones. And when it comes to drones and their use on the battlefield, both as an offensive weapon and not just firing a Hellfire missile from above, but is actually a drone that can fly into the door of a bunker that in a trench. Holy smokes. That is, that's Star Wars kinds of technology. The ISR that comes with it. This is something that was not in widespread use, even I think envisioned when Putin started the special military operation in February 2022. Now, you can't imagine a day going by without the troops operating on that front. And in that particular type of technology, that is what Ukraine's lacking. They don't have that same kind of technology. Yeah, and they created some drones that were able to fly into some buildings. But what we see repeatedly on the Telegram channels, for example, are these drones flying into M1 Abrams tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles. And man, they light off like Roman candles. So all of a sudden, you've got multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment that are being destroyed by drones that may cost $5,000, maybe $5,000 easily. So just if you will, the return on investment of investing in drones that are being used on the battlefield to chew up multiple $1 million worth of equipment, something that, the Biden White House has never even caught up to yet.
And, it's interesting because I just saw some news here in the last 10 days or so that showed that, and apparently confirmed that even domestically, the Ukraine side had produced close to 1 million drones of all the various types in the calendar year 2024. But I think that the big issue is obviously the Russian side has been able to produce even more.
Right.
But the problem is, and tell me if you agree with this, is that the big difference isn't the number that either side brings, but then the countermeasures that each side has.
Exactly.
And apparently Russia can intercept at a higher rate the number from the Ukraine side, but by electronic warfare and other means.
No, that's exactly right. In fact, when some of the electronic countermeasures started proving effective in disrupting the signal that the drones were operating on, the Russians, and just a snap of fingers, came up with drones that were guided with fiber optic wire. Can you imagine the spool on that? Because we're not talking something flying 100 yards; it's flying kilometers, trailing this fiber optic cable. And no matter how much the electronic countermeasures are fired at it by the Ukrainians, doesn't work, and boom. And so Ukraine hasn't been able to advance on that front. And again, what this illustrates.
Well, actually did. I saw just last week a video.
Did they finally get one?
That they're figuring some out, but the numbers are so small that it hasn't had any impact on any front at all. But just shows you part of the countermeasure, whatever escalation process. But
it also shows you, it gives some insight from looking at it as an analyst of, hey, these Russians are able to, the traditional view of Russia is this rigid pyramid that only the decisions are made at the top and nobody at the bottom gets any input, and therefore they're going to lose. Instead, what you're seeing is a very dynamic organization that operates much like, the stories we were told of U.S. soldiers in Normandy during World War II, where they're trying to figure out how to get through the hedgerows, and you had a bunch of these farm boys figure out how to improvise some basically bulldozer-type instruments to attach to tractors in order to get through them. So they didn't have to wait for, General Omar Bradley to figure out the decision. You had these corporals and privates and sergeants going, hey, let's get this and get going. Russians are doing the same thing. And so we ought to pay attention to that, because that's a formidable fighting force. You're not seeing that same kind of innovation on the Ukrainian side, in part because so many have died. You don't have that senior NCO corps in order to help, mentor and bring the younger guys along.
Well, yeah, and plus, Larry, as I talk about a lot, which is anguishing for me to continue to point out, is that even if the Ukraine side does come up with a lot of innovation, and they have, in terms of numbers, maybe not volume, but certainly in numbers. But if you don't have trained men to use them, it's not going to make any difference. And they just don't have them. And all these guys that they're force mobilizing in, they don't count, honestly. They don't, because they're just men in a uniform. They're not trained soldiers. So, I mean, we've seen it over and over. And this is so important to understand in the context with which we're giving this information out here. If the side that's receiving this $1.2 billion is mostly guys who aren't trained and don't know how to use this stuff, then what difference is it going to make?
Yeah, none at all. And that's, people just don't understand the vast number of skills that you have to teach somebody if you're going to put them into a combat operation. Like something as simple as infantry. Okay, they're going to give you a rifle, and you say, well, it's just, just point and shoot. Except when you're working with 15, 20, 30, 40 other guys, you got to make sure that you have trained everybody so that they don't point that gun at each other inadvertently in the midst of a panicked attack, in the midst of a firefight where they're trying to save their lives, and all of a sudden they're shooting their own buddies. How to communicate. And how to communicate, both knowing where you are on a map, how to properly read map coordinates, and then to be able to call in artillery strikes or mortar strikes or air strikes based upon those coordinates. Those are just like two simple areas. And as you know through your own experience, you're going to spend a few weeks getting that down into the minds of troops so that they can do it under stress. And that's what these, I'm not presenting myself as, Mark the military guy, but I was fortunate to be mentored both by a Marine colonel and an Army colonel. And both men were, hard as woodpecker lips. And so I learned a lot from them, and the practicalities that what is required for training in order to get performance on a battlefield. Two different things. And that's what all these damn civilians that are running the operation in Washington and in NATO don't understand.
Yeah,
They
and
don't
let me
understand
show
it.
you one more example of exactly the kind of person you're talking about. Here, just a few days ago, was Secretary of State Anthony Blinken talking about how we're going to achieve a just peace. Now, let me warn you before you watch this, he's going to say something toward the end that probably will get your eyes to pop open the way mine did. See if you can catch it.
I want to make sure that we're giving the incoming administration and the Ukrainians the strongest possible hand to play going into 2025. The Ukrainians have to make fundamental decisions about carrying on the fight or looking to negotiate and try to bring this to a ceasefire. The fundamental question is whether Russia is prepared to do that and to do that in good faith. But if it moves to that, we want to make sure that the Ukrainians and the Trump administration have the best hand to play to cut the strongest possible deal. And that means trying to reinforce Ukraine's position on the battlefield, making sure that it has the money, that it has the munitions, and that it has the mobilized manpower. And if this gets to a place where there is a ceasefire, and it's a ceasefire that's on just and durable terms, that would be a good thing. Ukraine is on a path to success. It's a country that is standing strongly as an independent country. It was not erased from the map. That's what Putin wanted to do. He's failed. It can stand strongly on its own feet, militarily, economically, democratically. That's the best possible rebuke to Putin.
Oh my God, what world is he talking about? That they're on a path to success, that can stand strong on their own 2 feet? What are your reactions?
He's been hitting the magic mushrooms, I guess. He's off on some psychedelic trip. If the United States cuts off funding today, Ukraine's ability to continue fighting and sustain forces in the field would be done by, so today's Tuesday, it'd be over by Friday, maybe Monday at the latest. So there's just, but that's what I'm talking about, Danny, earlier, with this disconnect between reality and then what the people like Blinken are saying. And you've got to come back to saying, is he just ignoring the intelligence, or is that what the intelligence community is telling them based upon what, the intelligence that they're acting on is what's being given to them by Ukrainian officials? And I'm increasingly suspecting it's the latter, that the United States, instead of doing any kind of independent thinking, any kind of independent analysis, is completely surrendered to taking information at face value from the Ukrainians and repeating it. And we do so not only at our own peril, but at the peril of the Ukrainians, because it's just dead ass wrong.
But Larry, I mean, I got to say, maybe that's going on. I will even say it's likely that what you describe in the intelligence community is going on. But holy crap! I mean, even if you're one of the reporters, the anchors that are sitting in the room that don't have access to any intelligence, when he says something like that, by looking back at what has happened over the last nearly 3 years, you should say, whoa, hang on, Mr. Secretary. Could you explain how what you consider them to be standing on their own 2 feet? I mean, to me, Larry, this is why so many people are turning away from conventional mainstream media in droves, because no one challenged him on that. No one called out that that's insane. That's ludicrous to suggest that they're trending towards success when they're trending toward unmitigated disaster. And yet no one's questioning him on that. That's one of the things that really bothers me.
Yeah, well, it's like that scene from the movie Princess Bride where the actor William Shawn kept saying, "Inconceivable, inconceivable." Well, you want to turn to Blinken and say, standing on their own 2 feet? I don't think you know what that word means. I don't think you understand the meaning of those phrases, because if you did, you wouldn't be saying that. So it's that the difference is Princess Bride was a comedy. This is a tragedy, what's unfolding in Ukraine. And but it's further exposing the weakness of the United States. And we've got, and it's not just here in Ukraine, because we're seeing it as well in places like the Red Sea with our aircraft carrier task force, that after we're now more than a year since Austin announced Operation Prosperity Guardian, and we still can't open the Red Sea. We still cannot stop the Houthis, which was what we were ostensibly going to do. So it's not just in Ukraine that we're failing. We're seeing a failure of U.S. military power projection across the board. What has been exposed in Ukraine We can't produce enough artillery shells. We can't produce enough HIMARS. We can't produce enough Patriots. What are we good at? Okay, could we focus on that? We can't train Ukrainian pilots. We tried. And well, they're not able to fly those planes. And
we tried to do it with the compressed edition, just like we tried to train them with the compressed edition prior to the 2023 offensive, and that had the predictable results. And this one had the predictable when you try to shortchange everything instead of like an American version where we would train them 2 full years before they even got to go in a combat operation after they had learned how to fly already. We tried to do it in 6 months here and said, yeah, that's going to be good enough. But it just shows the complete absurdity of our view. To your point here, I want to drill in on something else that he said in that, because that's going to kind of transition into the second part of this that we talked about at the outset. That's the outgoing administration, and then let's look at the incoming administration too, because you're about to see a similar dynamic here. One of the things Blinken said at the end of that was that he wanted to reach a just and enduring peace if negotiations ever come to pass, to use his phrase there. Well, obviously they're going to, because Trump's already laid that foundation and said unequivocally that is what he's going to do. But now then the term just peace, that is very much a product of whose interpretation you're using for the term just, because I think the U.S. side and certainly the Ukrainian side have a very different definition of just than Putin's going to. We'll show that in a second. But first of all, let me go to General Kellogg, who's been the designated, I guess, the czar for the Ukraine-Russia negotiations under the Trump administration once he takes power on the 20th. He was interviewed on Fox News a couple of days ago asking, what are you going to do? What is Trump going to do when he comes in? Here's the first part.
The president is very, very consistent about what he wants, and that is to stop the killing and bring peace to the region. It's his number one international priority. But he wants a peace that's going to be fair, it's going to be sustainable, it's going to be secure. We've seen peace processes happen in the past, or they've tried to, with Ukraine and Russia and the Minsk process, and it's failed miserably. The president's not going to go there. He understands the importance of this. He understands the importance of the relations he's got with his allies and also with Vladimir Putin as well. And he's the man who can bring this to a conclusion, and I really believe he will.
Okay, a lot to unpack there. I'm going to get to the point about where he also said a just and fair negotiated end. We'll get to that in a second. But the first part I want to look at there was that he pointed out the failure of the Minsk agreements, and Trump's not going to let that happen again. So it's unclear what he meant by that, because it could mean a couple of pretty different things. But I wonder if you can talk about when Putin's ears hear Minsk agreements and any relation with future negotiations, what do you think he hears?
Well, what he hears is that the birth of the Minsk agreements came at a time that the Donbass militia, with the backing of Russia, had the Ukrainian army on the verge of defeat. And because of that, and I think this is 2015, because of that, Angela Merkel jumped on a plane, flew to Moscow, basically begged, pleaded, and bamboozled Vladimir Putin. Putin agreed to this Minsk agreement process, and to only learn later, much to his chagrin, that it was a fraud. It was a charade. That the only reason Merkel and Hollande, who was then in charge of France, the only reason they did this was to buy time so that they could rebuild the Ukrainian army so they could take another whack at those Russians. So when Putin hears Minsk agreement, he's hearing a fraudulent agreement that was done cynically for the purpose of trying to ultimately deceive and destroy Russia. So he's not signing on to anything like that ever again. And that's the problem, I think, that Kellogg and Trump and the rest have. They don't understand that, Russia's willing to talk about permanent peace, which means not that you're going to delay bringing Ukraine into NATO. Ukraine does not ever get into NATO. Russia's not going to allow NATO to come into its territory that traditionally was Russia. Ain't going to happen. So we're going to have a security arrangement that will recognize that you're no longer going to continue to be a threat to us, and you're going to stop trying to stir up color revolutions in Georgia and revolutions in Romania, where you interfere. The West is interfering, and the West is doing the same in Armenia. Putin's looking at this in a broad picture. So this is not just one area.
So, okay, two-part question. First part, that's how Putin views what he thinks of when he hears the word Minsk agreements. What do you think Kellogg means when he says Minsk agreements that Trump, quote, isn't going to let happen?
Yeah, well, that I think he at least recognizes that the Minsk agreement was a fraud, that it was not genuine and not sincere. Now, I don't discount Donald Trump's abilities to try to negotiate a deal. But when you're negotiating a deal, you have to understand what is it that the other side needs or wants. Russia, if you go in with the assumption that Russia is suffering heavy losses, that it is that this war is savaging its economy and causing domestic political unrest, then you're proceeding on false assumptions. And any proposal you make based upon that, it's like if you and I were in negotiations and I assumed that you only had $1,000 in your bank account, and so I'm offering you this deal that I'm going to put $5,000 in there, and I don't understand that you're actually sitting on $5 million. Well, the negotiation is going to be a little different because you don't need my $5,000. You know, you probably have toilet paper dispensers with $5,000 rolls, you know? Yeah, I don't need that. So, but the point is, you've got to understand what the other side's actual needs are and what their situation is. And what's Russia's situation? They're beating the hell out of Ukraine and NATO in the process. They have exposed the fact that NATO can't supply troops, just like, you know, we talked about, or actually I was on another show before this with Alex Craner, and they're talking about the Brits starting, we're going to send troops to Ukraine. And yet the front pages of the British newspapers are about the British soldiers are bailing out in droves, and they can't even replace through recruitment the numbers who are resigning. And it's like, what fantasy world are you clowns living in?
I was on George Galloway just yesterday, I think it was the day before yesterday, and he asked me that same question. He said, we can't even field the formations we have. What is anyone talking about sending somebody to Ukraine that we can do?
Yeah.
So I want to go down a path that you're talking about here a little bit more and zero in on it. You said what Russia wants. I'm going to show you a couple of clips here that shows very graphically what Putin wants. First of all, I'm going to let Putin speak for himself. Here's what he says his entry point is.
We don't have any preconditions for talks. We are ready to engage in a conversation without preconditions. But there has to be a basis of something that we've agreed upon during the talks in Istanbul in late 2022, and based, of course, on the realities on the ground at this moment.
Okay, so those two things, he said, there are much more important, I think, than certainly most American audiences understand. He said there's no preconditions to talk. We'll just sit down. Yeah, you don't have to meet this before I'll even discuss. We'll sit down and discuss where we are right now. As long as you understand there are two things that have to become. Number one is realities on the ground. I'll talk about that second. And then number two, he refers back to Istanbul in 2022. And if you could just to kind of remind our viewers, what was his basic deal in 2022 that now he's saying will form something close to the baseline?
Well, actually, it's changed dramatically because in 2022, they'd agreed that Russia would withdraw from the Donbass, that Donetsk and Luhansk would remain as part of Ukraine, provided that Ukraine didn't get involved, rejected going into NATO, that it would provide guarantees for the rights of the Russian speakers in those territories. And that was the essence of that deal. But then when that deal fell apart and Washington intervened and used Boris Johnson as its tool to do so, then Russia's position hardened. So that's why in September of 2022, when they had the elections in Zaporizhia, in Kherson, in Luhansk, and Donetsk, those four oblasts now entered into Russia as republics. They're part of the Federal Republic of Russia. So now those are 4 new parts of Russia that since Istanbul, Putin has said, okay, that's Russia. We're not going to negotiate on giving up parts of Russia. Those are Russian. So now the negotiation is you, Ukraine, withdraw your forces from our territory, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, Luhansk, and then we'll talk.
Yeah, and we'll see how that's going to work out. Gary, I'm trying to throw you a curveball here. Do you have that June 14th handy?
Checking it right now, looking for it.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, we'll pull that up in just a second. Because the second video that I want to show you is going to show you graphically on a map what we're talking about here. But I think it's really important to show the bridge between Istanbul and where he's about to go now, because you just pointed out something really, really important there, that it's actually about what he now, and it doesn't matter if the rest of the world, no one else in the rest of the world accepts this annexation, et cetera. He does. And since he has the, whatever it is, 1.5 million active forces and all those ammunition and weapons, you have to take that into account, whether you hate the idea or not. That's just the reality, which was the second thing, or the other thing that he said. It has to reflect what the truth is on the ground, and that's part of it. Gary, just give me a thumbs up whenever you get that. Okay, he's not going to have it. It's not important. We'll just bypass this. Bottom line is what he said. He reiterated in that June 5th that he wants not just a freeze, not just a ceasefire, but an actual end of the war. Yeah. And it's going to be no NATO, non-nuclear, and recognize all 4 of those oblasts. Now, I'm going to show you something from Military Summary a couple of days ago that demonstrated on a map what he's talking about and the difference of the gulf between where the line is right now and where Putin sees it as being like a non-negotiable. This will be the end point.
Moscow plans to achieve victory in the war, and the goals announced by Putin in June. The Russian army sets its goal for 2025 to liberate the entire territory of 4 regions. So when talking about these 4 regions, let's take a look at Ukraine once again, and let's add this polygon on map. So this is the Putin peace agreements. According to Putin and now according to Belarus, of all these regions that are blinking with black is the territories that the Russians are planning to establish control over in 2025. This is the rest of the Kherson region. This is the huge part of the Zaporozhye region, including the city of Zaporozhye. Of course, this is the rest of the Donetsk region. We're talking about the cities like Pokrovsk, Kramatorsk, Slaviansk, Konstantinovka, lots of very big cities, telling the truth, and just several square kilometers of Lugansk direction.
So you see that I'm actually going to pull that up on a different map here so we can just look at it. But all of these shaded areas right here, look, this is where Ukraine soldiers are right now. They're manning all this stuff. So for there to be a deal, Putin is saying my apparent entry point for negotiations is all of this territory. And some of this includes, I think, even the city of Zaporizhia, which is not currently in Russian hands. But you see, this is a huge amount of territory, even compared to what they've taken in all of 2024. So let me ask you, how does Ukraine come to the position, and by Ukraine, I mean Zelensky. How does Zelensky say, yeah, I'm going to negotiate to give up territory that I currently still own? And is Trump going to be willing to negotiate something away like that? What do you think?
Well, I don't think either Trump or Zelensky will have a choice in the matter. So I wore this armband. It says Donbass Serce Rossiya, Donbass, the heart of Russia. And this area of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia really is, it's mineral rich, and it has been the industrial heartland of Russia going back into, the 1930s. And so, Russia sees it both from a strategic standpoint as critical, as well as from a cultural and historical standpoint. So this I think has now become a non-negotiable point for Vladimir Putin. They're not going to give up any of that territory, and the options that the United States and Zelensky have is either surrender, pull the troops out, and avoid further bloodshed, or Russia will continue to kill them and will drive them out. because there's nothing the West can do to stop it. That's the reality.
And here's wow, this is going to really complicate President Trump and General Kellogg's efforts when they come in. And by the way, I've taken issue a lot of things with General Kellogg, but I promise you, I wish him all the luck in the world in helping getting this thing negotiated to an end. I'm totally supportive of what they're trying to do. But here's the complicating factors. Here is Zelensky, I believe it's just a couple of days ago, talking about where his mind is heading into this negotiating period.
Ми обов'язково продовжимо завдавати ударів по російських військових об'єктах дронами і ракетами, і все більше українськими по саме тим військовим базам, по саме тій російській воєнній інфраструктурі, яка використовується в такому терорі проти наших людей. Наш захист абсолютно справедливий.
Okay, so now there has been a lot of video on the internet lately, a lot of news reports out that Zelensky is doing exactly what he said there, and they are continuing to launch. They hit the buildings in Kazan. They've attacked, I think, for the second time in a week, an oil facility in Oriol, I believe it was. They continue hitting other stuff. Rylsk, I think, is another city that was hit. There was an attack by the Ukrainian side. So it seems he's making good on that. Is there any value for the Ukraine side in taking that actions? And does it, as apparently Zelensky thinks, give him a better negotiating position to actually reach an end?
Simple answer is no. When you compare the volume of what Russia launches onto Ukraine on a single day, it dwarfs all of this. If you put everything that Ukraine has done in terms of drone attacks, attacks over the last week, that doesn't even begin to match what Russia can do in one single day to Ukraine and does on multiple days. And even when Russia does that on multiple days, it does not, put the Ukraine itself into a fetal position where they're crying for mercy. Stop it. We can't stand it anymore. They persist. The one thing I've always, wondered, I'm not privy to the Russian general staff calculations. I wonder why, at the outset, they didn't blow every single bridge over the Dnieper River. In other words, cut off the ability of Ukraine in the West to resupply troops in the East. Because if you take down the land routes, if you take down those railroad routes, then how are you going to sustain an army of 100,000, 200,000 guys out in the field?
Fair question.
So the only thing I can come up with is that part of the Russian general staff's plans, the reason they haven't, is because they intend to use those bridges. That's their eventual intent. They don't want to have to destroy them and then rebuild them. They want to have them intact so that they can use them when they cross the Dnieper. And they're going to
I've heard that before, but I think that's it. If that is what their thinking was, I think it was a really bad choice because the price they have paid for now nearly 3 years has been extraordinary. And the chances that the Ukraine side would go over those bridges and not blow them themselves to prevent that very thing, I think is pretty high. So that was a bad calculation if it was.
And that's why I'd love to get them to sit down and say, hey, explain this to me. How does this how does this work? What's your thinking? Now, the reality is, from Media Zona, their casualty count, Russian casualties have actually been declining significantly over the last 4 months, even though the fighting has intensified. And part of that is attributed to the fact that Ukraine increasingly is deploying people to the front lines that don't know how to shoot and how to operate artillery and mortars. Tanks.
Yeah. Listen, let me tag on that. Let me jump right in on that because I got information just this morning from someone who has direct contacts with people on the line on the Ukraine side, and they were talking about for OPSEC. They waited a while to reveal this, but when Vuhledar fell, whatever it was, a month and a half ago or so, or a month or so. They said that the Ukraine side was really upset at Syrskyi and the general staff because they said that they had been begging for supplies. They said they had a great position, had held up for a year and a half on this, and the terrain was to their advantage in their favor, but they needed more supplies, more ammunition, and certainly more support as well, none of which they got. And then apparently in the 11th hour, they got 3 battalions of people who were not trained in that kind of fighting, had no experience, and they didn't know how to do that stuff. And so most of them gave up. Most of them quit when they came in there. And then, of course, then the whole thing fell apart. I doubt that's an isolated situation, and it's going to continue to impose itself.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And that goes back to, you and I both have been on the same sheet of music for a long while, that trained manpower is the heart and soul of any effective military organization. And when you're talking trained manpower, you're not just talking corporals and privates. You're talking an intact group of non-commissioned officers, the various flavors of sergeants that staff and chief warrant officers, and then as well as seasoned officers that have had some kind of command, and that they know how to, as you know in your experience, a good officer is somebody who actually listens to suggestions from a senior NCO, particularly if that officer has, there are a lot of staff sergeants that have saved a lot of captains' asses over throughout history.
I can remember Sergeant May that saved my butt a lot of times when I was a major, not XO of a CAV squadron. So I'm right with you.
Yeah. So, and how do you get that? Well, that's nothing that you go out and do in a 13-week recruiting process.
Right.
That's something that's developed over time, and you've got to have the elements in place so that you can replace, because there will be losses in combat. And, the United States didn't, I'm not even sure we really learned that lesson in World War II, because our losses were so low compared to what Russia did.
Yeah.
Russia learned that lesson. And that's one of the things I think we also failed to take into account when doing the analysis of the Russian military. The Russian people culturally understand what war is and what the terrible losses are, because almost every family lost one or more family members in that war. Whereas in the United States, the number of American families that were grieving the loss of a son, because the reality, most of the people that were killed in war in the U.S. military were men, not women. Were very few. We had the numbers ranged between 350 and 470. And what I find shocking is, even to this day, the Department of Defense does not have a good solid number on what the actual number of KIA were in World War II.
Yeah, they usually say it's around 400,000.
Yeah, but when you look
total deaths, not just KIA.
So when you look at the the comparative population size, Russia lost twice that many soldiers in just the Battle of Stalingrad.
Yeah.
That's what we lost in all of World War II. And anybody that's seen the Clint Eastwood movie Flag of Our Fathers, about the guys that raised the flag on Iwo Jima, and how the American public was growing tired of the war and they needed to get out there and use these we really hadn't suffered as a country, and yet we were then sucking air during that generation. Today, we have never, the people of the United States have never tasted the bitter pill of war, and the sacrifice that comes with it, and the loss of life that comes with it. And so that's why we're so cavalier in going to war. Well, that doesn't cost us anything. In fact, we make money off of it.
Listen, and I want to end on that subject, or that topic rather, in a slightly different way. So we can agree that however hard, however complex, easy, long, whatever, eventually there will be a negotiated settlement. All wars eventually end. This one certainly will too. And so we'll probably talk in the new year, especially as it gets closer to January 20th, how the Trump administration may actually conduct these and how the negotiations may go, et cetera. But I want to end on something that I think is on a longer term scale, possibly far more consequential negatively for us. And that is, as you talked about a little bit at various points during this episode here, about how, whether it's the Abrams or the HIMARS, the ATACMS, the F-16s, et cetera, how they haven't made a whole lot of difference on the battlefield. They've all been relatively neutralized. Talk about, for the remainder of the time we have here, on how you view the potential risk to American national security as a result of all of our weapon systems having been put out there and field tested so that the enemy can figure ways to defeat them or mitigate them if we then at some point have to fight a war conventionally with any major power, be it China, Russia, whatever?
Well, our weapons system design is not integrated with a strategic vision. And Andrei Martyanov, who's been on your show several times, he's written 4 terrific books. And the very first book he came out with 7 years ago, Losing Military Supremacy. I really encourage folks, if you're looking for a late Christmas gift, buy that, read it, and give it to your friends. But what Andrei points out is that the Russians, in contrast to the United States, when they're developing weapon systems that are designed to be integrated into a national defense strategy of protecting the Russian homeland from an invasion from outside. Whereas what the United States has relied upon is this nuclear triad, really, where we can project force through the Navy and project force through the air with our Air Force. But our ground combat capability really is somewhat limited. We're an expeditionary military force. Well, what has been exposed now over the course of the war, both in Ukraine and in the Middle East, is that one, the United States does not have any kind of supremacy when it comes to air defense systems. Our air defense systems don't work. They suck. They get defeated easily with strategic systems that Russia has deployed.
And I'm sorry, let me just caveat a piece in there, because I just got an email yesterday from Professor Ted Postal of MIT. We'll be doing a show in the new year where he is going to make the case that he's going to show physical evidence from 1991 and from 2024 to where there has been almost no advance in the capacity of our PAC systems to intercept enemy incoming missiles. So we've been very static, and it's been static low at that. So what you're saying is even more right than I think people realize.
Well, we saw just the other day in Israel where the Houthis fired apparently what's been described as a hypersonic ballistic missile that Israel failed to shoot down. And we saw 2 of the air defense systems go up one after another trying to shoot it down, and they failed. I thought that Iron Dome was impregnable. Well, a little bit pregnant.
Single missile. It wasn't even part of a barrage that maybe the numbers weren't there. It was one missile and
just
got through.
Yeah, so that's so what we're looking at is both this combination of failure to develop weapon systems that are cost effective, that can be easily replaced. Because you look at the F-35 right now. The last number I saw on that, both the cost of production and the cost of operation, is something like $200 million a copy.
Yeah.
I mean, that's insane. Per piece. And then when it was Matt Gaetz that exposed that only like 29% were combat ready. Similarly, as we've seen what the Houthis have demonstrated to the U.S. Navy, what the limits are of U.S. ability to project naval power. 30 years ago, we could sell a carrier task force group in, and man, we were a tough customer to deal with. Today, when someone like the Houthis can have a hypersonic missile that can penetrate our air defense system around those carriers, and the cruisers and destroyers that are there to try to provide a shield fail. And we saw just the other day that we shot down. We're still not sure if we shot down our own F-18 or if the Houthis did it. But regardless, an F-18 went into drink. Fortunately, the 2 pilots were not killed. But what has been exposed is that the United States has an extremely expensive, highly it's not easy to replace equipment, and it doesn't meet the current technical requirements of the battlefield, which, like I said, Russia in their flexibility, they're able to crank out tanks, they're able to crank out hypersonic missiles, the Iskanders, for example, but and the Kinzhals, but at the same time, they've been able to really shift direction and start mass producing drones, and they're getting drones as well out of Iran. and so they're not stuck, and in the process of doing this, their biggest problem is a manpower shortage because everybody's got full employment in Russia. Their economy's not hurting, and people got plenty of money to go buy goods in the shops. So the problem, the challenge the United States faces is we are still locked into a 20th century mentality.
Yeah, that's so true.
And we have not caught up to the 21st. And it's probably, we're not going to catch up until we get defeated in a war.
Right. I was going to say, yeah, because that requires a change of mentality. It requires a willingness to recognize that our ways are not working and need dramatic failure. And I see zero evidence that anybody's going to do that. As a matter of fact, you had Mitch McConnell just wrote a piece in the Foreign Affairs that what he does is argue basically for what we've been doing bigger and more of it and more money, just increase the budget. It's $900 billion is not near enough, is the actual quote he said. No reform of anything, just more of what we've been doing, oblivious to the requirements here. And what I fear is, and we'll just take this theoretical possibility, is that in the future, if we ever get into a fight with China over Taiwan, regardless of how it starts, if we do that, I believe that a lot of these lessons that the Russians have learned here with our equipment, with our interceptor missiles, with our air power, with our naval forces, et cetera, has been passed along to their buddies in Beijing, and they will be more effective even earlier on. And it seems that their force has learned the lesson that you talked about, because at least from what I can gather through open source means is that they do produce stuff that will that they can do a lot of. It's cheap to make. That their capacity to sustain long drives with the ammunition as well as the platforms is already in place. In place, not in the future. Whereas ours basically doesn't exist. And if we fight, then I fear that we will suffer the very defeat, outright, no question about it, defeat that you talk about is necessary for reform. And I weep for that day.
Well, I'm sure several Vietnam vets, and it's always an interesting conversation because they'll say basically, well, yeah, we could have won it, but we just didn't try hard enough. The more cowbell. We just didn't have enough cowbell. Would have put more cowbell in there, by God, we would have won. Well, what about Iraq? Not enough cowbell. What about Afghanistan? Not enough cowbell. Let me suggest that the cowbell ain't the problem. The problem is we lack a strategy, and we don't understand the politics of what we're dealing with in these regions, or we're so fixated upon what outcome. When I'm teaching people to shoot, one of the consequences that if you're firing at a target, you get what's called tunnel vision. So your vision narrows, and all of you're seeing is what's in front of you, and you lose awareness of your surroundings. So we've got to learn how to break out of that tunnel vision, and we get so fixated upon our false narrative that Russia and China are empires intent on conquering the world, that we've got to stop them from conquering the world, when in the process we keep taking the actions that convince them that we're the threat. Because they're not the ones with 700 plus military bases around the world. We are. They're not the ones that have been involved with multiple military conflicts overseas and killed literally millions. When you rack up the death toll over the last 60 years between Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Panama. I mean, it's just Syria, Yugoslavia.
Niger, just keep ad infinitum. Yeah, they just keep adding up there.
We're the ones with the body count, not them.
I know, and I just don't think that. I think, Larry, I think that we're doomed to have to suffer that defeat you have, because this foreign affairs piece by Mitch McConnell is a perfect example. I haven't seen any pushback on it at all. I did, but nobody in the mainstream media, so no one is even thinking there's anything wrong with it, which tells me that we're going to continue to plow forward until we fall off that cliff that you're describing.
You now know what Jeremiah felt like in the Old Testament when he was that voice crying in the wilderness, trying to
My wife
warn,
did the same
trying to
thing,
warn
and
the
yes, I do.
Israelis.
Yeah.
Nobody had listened, but at least you were warning them.
I do feel that way sometimes, I have to say. Well, listen, on that cheery note,
Yeah.
we'll bring this one to a close here. And I don't know if we're going to have you back on before the new year. If we don't, I just wish you and your family a happy Christmas and a wonderful new year. And we'll just keep knocking out the truth, and and we won't stop as long as there's any possibility of changing course before we go off that cliff. And we are very, very grateful for you for all the times you come on this year to share your views on that, and look forward to seeing you in 25.
Thanks so much, Danny, and best to you and to Gary.
Thank you very much. And we appreciate you guys today. Not sure if we're going to be on the air tomorrow. We may possibly do one thing, being it's Christmas Day. Even we may take a day off here. We'll wait and see how that works out. But definitely on the backside of that, we're going to continue on, because things in the world aren't stopping because of a holiday, and neither are we, because you deserve the unmitigated truth, and we will bring it to you. Thank you very much for all your support, folks. We've had a fantastic year that we've had so far, and all of it is due to you guys watching. And to remind you before we get off, we're also in the podcast area. Go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict, anywhere you get your podcast. Type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and you will find us waiting there for you. Be sure to share that with other folks. Maybe that can be your stocking stuff for Christmas present. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.